The Amazon rainforest is unlike any other forest on the planet. It is a living organism half the size of Europe, where every creature is either hunting or hiding from the hunter. There is no neutral territory here. The trees' crowns meet at 165 feet, turning the ground beneath them into eternal twilight. In this place, sounds are often deceptive. A jaguar's roar can be heard a mile away, while poisonous snakes creep up silently. Local tribes say simply, "The jungle will either let you go or keep you forever." Brazilian search and rescue services give those lost in this green hell exactly 5 days. After that, the operation is called off, not out of cruelty, but out of an understanding of statistics. In a jungle of this size, finding a crash plane is more complicated than finding a needle in a haystack. On the morning of 28 January 2021, 35-year-old pilot Antonio Sena took off in his Cessna and headed for one of the most remote points in this green ocean. A few hours later, he simply disappeared from the radar. For Antonio, and for the services that rushed to search for him, a 5-day timer was started. He was neither a tourist nor an adventurer. Antonio Sena was a professional small aircraft pilot who grew up in Santarém, a city at the confluence of the great Amazon and Tapajós rivers. He knew this sky and this forest. His logbook totaled 2,400 flight hours. He was an experienced and confident pilot. A few years ago, he decided to trade the sky for the ground. In search of a more stable life, Antonio opened a small restaurant in his hometown. It was a modest but honest establishment, catering to working people like himself. But then the pandemic hit. Like millions of others, Antonio lost everything. The strict lockdowns in Brazil destroyed his business. He found himself in a difficult financial situation, unable to cover even his basic expenses. Desperation forced him to return to the cockpit, and he was ready to take on any job. He was offered a job as an air taxi driver for the garimpeiros. It was a difficult decision. Garimpeiros, illegal gold miners, were a cancer on the Amazon. They cut down protected forests, invaded the lands of indigenous peoples, and poisoned rivers with mercury. Antonio, who grew up here, understood this better than most. But despair drowned out the voice of conscience, and not just despair. He was promised 1,600 reais for this one trip. It was quick, dirty money, an amount that could cover his most urgent debts and give his family some breathing room. That was the price of his compromise. He reluctantly agreed. On 28 January 2021, 2 days before his 36th birthday, he was preparing for his first solo flight for his new employers. The task was to transport cargo from Alenquer to the illegal California mine, hidden deep in the Maicuru Reserve. The job he had taken to survive in the world of humans was now preparing to kill him in the world of the jungle. On the morning of 28 January, Antonio Sena taxied his 48-year-old Cessna onto the runway in Alenquer. The plane was heavy. Barrels of diesel fuel were secured in the cargo compartment right behind him. The plane lifted off the ground, and the flight began normally. Below, stretching to the horizon, was the endless green ocean of the Amazon. For a pilot who had spent 2,400 hours in the sky, it was almost routine. The sun was shining, and the plane's old but reliable engine was humming smoothly. At that moment, Antonio felt relieved. After months of despair on the ground, he was back in his element. He was doing what he did best and getting paid 2,600 reais for it. He was flying at 3,000 feet, the ideal altitude for visual flight over this endless carpet. He was in harmony with the machine in the sky, doing his dubious but necessary job. And at that very moment, the engine stalled. There was no panic in the cockpit, only the cold, almost sterile calculation of a professional. The steady hum was replaced by dead silence, broken only by the wind's whistling. 3.5 minutes. That was precisely how much time he had left before the uncontrollable machine, filled to the brim with fuel, hit the ground. Antonio's fingers instinctively reached for the controls, trying to restart the engine and switch fuel tanks. It was useless. The 48-year-old plane had become a glider weighing 1.5 tons. He grabbed the portable radio and pressed the button. His voice was utterly calm. "Mayday, mayday, mayday. This is PTIRJ. I repeat in letters, Papa, Tango, India, Romeo, Juliet. I am falling between Alenquer and California Strip." He let go of the radio. Now all his attention was focused on the windshield. Below him was a boundless green carpet, a solid wall of 165-foot trees that would tear the plane to pieces at the slightest contact. He wasn't looking for a strip. He was looking for an anomaly, a clearing, a river, at least a swamp, any place where the trees weren't so tall, and he saw it. There was no time to assess, only to instinct. A small valley where the trees seemed lower. His gaze caught on a familiar silhouette of crowns. They were palm trees. A saving thought flashed through his mind. Palm trees mean water. Water meant softer, clayey or swampy soil. It was his only chance. He steered the Cessna straight into that narrow clearing. The collision was not an explosion, but a monstrous, deafening screech. The plane did not hit the ground. It broke through the canopy of the jungle. Antonio heard the metal of the fuselage tearing against branches as thick as telegraph poles. He felt thick branches breaking, tearing off the wings and slowing the fall. The plane was tossed and twisted until it finally crashed nose first into the red clay among those very palm trees. Silence fell. Somehow, he had survived. The silence was immediately broken by another sound, a hissing sound, and a sharp, acrid smell that overpowered even the smell of damp earth. Cargo. The barrels in the cargo compartment had cracked. 160 gallons of diesel fuel were leaking, flooding the cabin and instantly soaking his clothes. He was covered head to toe in fuel. The plane had turned into a time bomb, ticking away from the heat of the red-hot engine. Antonio unbuckled his seatbelt. He felt no pain, only a rush of adrenaline. Miraculously, the door wasn't jammed. He acted on pure instinct, not thinking, just doing. He grabbed his personal backpack lying nearby, tumbled out of the cockpit into the mud, and ran. He didn't look back. He just ran, stumbling over vines and roots, pushing through the thick undergrowth as fast as he could. A few minutes later, the earth shook. The Cessna exploded. A fireball and a column of black smoke rose above the green dome. Antonio collapsed to the ground, his heart pounding with adrenaline. He was in shock, but unharmed. Not a single fracture, just abrasions. He looked around at the place where he had fallen. A valley with palm trees, red clay, and the burning wreckage of the plane. He opened his backpack to take a quick inventory. Everything he had to survive in the Amazon. 3 bottles of water, 4 cans of soda, a small bag of bread, a pocket knife, some rope, a first aid kit, a flashlight, and a cell phone with an almost dead battery, and 2 lighters. He was alone, hundreds of miles from civilization, and his 5-day timer had started counting down. Antonio Senna, covered in diesel and mud, was sure he was alone. He couldn't know for sure that his last, desperate message, sent moments before the crash, had made it through the interference and the green carpet. His mayday had been heard. The signal, Papa, Tango, India, Romeo, Juliet, was recorded. While Antonio Senna was coming to his senses, looking at the burning plane, a full-scale operation was already underway in the command centers. The Brazilian Air Force took charge of the matter. This was not a symbolic attempt. Specialized patrol aircraft designed to scan vast areas were sent aloft. The crews worked in shifts, mapping out precise search sectors based on Antonio's last known position and his radio message. In total, the pilots will spend 86 flight hours in the air over the next week. They will methodically comb through an area of 8,000 square miles. This is an area larger than Jamaica. For Antonio Senna, who spent his first night in the jungle, these figures were unknown. He knew nothing about the scale of the operation or that people were looking for him. He knew only one thing. He had sent a Mayday signal. And in aviation, that means help is on the way. He just had to hold on. The first night was the worst. The shock receded, giving way to reality. He spent it sitting on the ground, leaning against a tree, a few hundred feet from the still smoldering wreckage. His clothes remained soaked through with diesel fuel, the acrid smell of which seemed to have seeped into his very skin. And then came the sounds. The Amazon is not a quiet place. It is a deafening cacophony of insect chirping, distant bird calls, and rustling in the undergrowth that made his heart skip a beat. He was in a world of predators, where every shadow seemed threatening, but he survived the night. With dawn came not only hope, but a plan. He was a pilot. He had been trained to survive. Rule number 1, stay at the crash site. The smoke from the wreckage was the best beacon. He set up camp. That was an exaggeration. Using his knife and rope, he built a primitive shelter out of palm leaves to protect himself from the almost daily tropical downpours. He imposed a strict diet. The bread, which quickly began to mold in the humid climate, ran out on the second day. But he had 4 cans of soda and 3 bottles of water. He stretched them out, taking a few small sips a day. He found a stream running through the valley. The water was murky, but it was water. On the second or third day, he heard it, a rumbling. It wasn't the roar of the jungle. It was the sound of an aeroplane engine. Hope hit him like a physical jolt. "They're here!" He rushed into the open space near the smoldering wreckage. He waved. He shouted at the top of his lungs, even though he knew they wouldn't hear him. The plane passed somewhere off to the side, and the sound faded away. Now he had a goal. He had to make himself visible. He began gathering firewood. It was painfully difficult. Everything around him was damp. With the help of 2 lighters, he tried to light a signal fire, adding fresh leaves to make the smoke thicker. But the 165-foot canopy of tree branches worked against him. The dense canopy scattered the smoke, preventing it from rising in a clear column. For the next few days he lived by this ritual. He heard planes several times a day. Each time it was the same desperate race. Light the fire, run out into the clearing, wave, shout. They flew by, sometimes closer, sometimes farther away. He saw them, silver dots piercing the sky, but they didn't see him. On the 7th day, Antonio heard a rumble right above his head. It was so close that it seemed to shake the leaves. This was his chance. He jumped out of his hiding place, waving his arms. He shouted until he was hoarse. He stared straight at the plane flying over his valley. He was sure they had seen him this time. He waited for the helicopter to tilt its wing, but the plane flew on steadily and disappeared over the horizon. In that very cockpit, several thousand feet above the ground, Brazilian Air Force pilots scanned another square of the green carpet through powerful optics. They saw only trees, a dense, endless, uniform green mass. No smoke, no tarpaulin, no metal glints. That same evening, the crews received new orders. After 86 flight hours and surveying 8,000 square miles, the Brazilian Air Force officially announced the suspension of the active phase of the search and rescue operation for pilot Antonio Senna. This was not an act of cruelty. It was cold, impersonal arithmetic known as international standards. It is a grim calculation in which human life is reduced to a graph. Rescuers know that a Cessna crash from 3,000 feet almost always means fatal injuries. They know that without clean water, the human body rarely survives more than 72 hours. And they know that the Amazon is not neutral territory. 100% humidity, the risk of infection, and predators accelerate the process. By the 5th day, according to these ruthless protocols, Antonio Senna's survival probability curve had fallen to almost 0. In the reports, he was no longer a missing pilot. He had become a statistical loss. From that point on, any further operation would be considered not a rescue of a living person, but a costly search for remains. Statistics had won. On the 8th day, Antonio woke up with an unfamiliar sensation. It was silent. Not the silence of the jungle, but the silence of the sky. For the first time in a week, he did not hear the hum of airplanes. He waited an hour, then another. He listened so intently that his ears rang. The planes did not fly over anymore. Antonio Sina sat down on the wet ground. At that moment, he understood. They were no longer looking for him. The world, to which he had desperately signaled for a whole week, had officially declared him dead. The silence that fell in the sky on the 8th day was louder than any explosion. The role of the crashed pilot was over. Staying with the wreckage, the only landmark in this green ocean, now meant simply waiting for the jungle to swallow him alive. The decision to leave the plane was a violation of every survival rule he had been taught, but Antonio knew something the rescuers did not. He was alive. His gaze fell on his backpack, on his cell phone. The battery was almost dead. He turned it on, perhaps for the very last time. Of course, there was no signal, but he didn't need a signal. He needed a map. He opened the geolocation app, and, as if by miracle, the device's cache had saved the only vital fragment of a map of the area. It wasn't a detailed topographical map, but it had the most critical information. His approximate location is marked with a blue dot and a thin blue line. The Peru River flowed 37 miles to the east. 37 miles. In the everyday world, that's an hour's drive. In the Amazon, without a machete, without food, and without trails, it was equivalent to a trip to the moon. But it was the goal. In the Amazon, a river is a highway, its fishermen, its settlements, its life. He didn't just look at the map. He stared at it, forcing his brain to memorize every bend, estimate the approximate distance, and, most importantly, fix the direction. Then the screen flickered and went dark forever. Antonio Sina got to his feet. All that remained of the wreckage was what could not be carried away. Everything that connected him to his past life. Only a knife, a rope, a flashlight, empty water bottles, and 2 lighters went into his backpack. The role of the pilot waiting for help was over. The journey of a ghost walking eastward was beginning. The journey began, and the jungle immediately showed how naive his hopes were. His plan to just go east was the plan of a man from another world. Here, under a solid dome of treetops, eternal twilight reigned. The position of the sun could only be guessed at for a couple of hours after dawn, while it hung low. This determined his unbearable rhythm. He walked only in the mornings, but it wasn't walking. It was a daily, hours-long battle with the forest. He fought his way through curtains of vines as sharp as rusty wire. He climbed over giant fallen trunks, slippery with moss. He sank waist-deep into rotting, sulfur-smelling swamps. His pocket knife was his only tool, but it was almost useless against this element. In 3 or 4 hours, he covered a mile at best, and all this time, he was wet. In the jungle, you are never dry. If there was no tropical downpour, the air was so saturated with moisture that it settled as condensation on his skin and clothes. His boots, constantly sloshing with water, became an instrument of torture. The skin on his feet began to rot, turn white, and peel off. He was developing what is known as trench foot, a slow, painful condition. The humidity brought insects with it. These were not just mosquitoes. They were swarms, clouds, a living, buzzing veil that covered him as soon as he stopped moving. He learned to fear not only what buzzed, but also what crawled. He knew what a tokandira was, a giant bullet ant. One bite felt like a gunshot, followed by 8 hours of agony, paralyzing pain and fever. After lunch, when the sun rose higher and disappeared into the foliage, he stopped his hike. The second part of his daily work began. The search for shelter. Fear became his primary teacher. At night, he heard jaguars. He never saw them, but once when he went down to the stream, he froze. The air was saturated with the sharp, coppery smell of old blood. The predator was nearby and had recently feasted. From that day on, his tactics became a ritual. He would go down to the stream, drink, fill his bottles, and leave immediately. He forced his exhausted body to climb the nearest hill, as far away as possible from the riverbed where predators hunted. And only there on the mountain did he begin to build his primitive shelter out of palm leaves. It gave him a fragile but vital sense of security. There was water, but his body was burning itself up. Hunger turned from a need into a chronic, nagging pain, and then into an obsession. His mind began to betray him. The patterns on the bark of trees suddenly started to form in his imagination into the menu of his old restaurant. He could stare at a leaf for hours, convincing himself that it was a piece of bread. Salvation came from the most unexpected source. He saw a flock of spider monkeys. They ran around the branches, screaming and eating some bright pink fruit. Antonio froze and watched. He watched them for several hours. The monkeys did not look sick. Finally, he made up his mind. He found the same tree and picked one fruit. It was a brew, resinous with a pungent smell, but, as it turned out, edible. It became his main food, but that wasn't enough. He needed protein. He began to instinctively scan the ground, looking at the undergrowth. In shallow nests on the ground lay large, bright blue eggs. They were Nambu bird eggs. It was a rare stroke of luck. He ate them raw. Finding such a nest meant another day of life. However, monkeys were not only a salvation, but also a curse. They were extremely territorial. On several occasions while setting up camp, he invaded their territory. The troops surrounded his shelter, making deafening, furious cries. They shook branches and threw sticks at him, trying to chase the stranger away. Weakened, he could only huddle under his canopy until they got bored. The days merged into one endless green, wet nightmare. In the morning, he would head east. In the afternoon, he would find water, climb a hill, and build a shelter. In the evening, he would search for brew, or, if he was lucky, Nambu eggs. And in the empty hours, of which there were too many, loneliness set in. The silence was more oppressive than the roar of jaguars. To keep from going mad, he began to talk. First, with himself, discussing his plan, then with his family. He had long, detailed conversations with his mother, promising her that he would return home soon. These ghosts became his only companions. The promises he made to his family were no longer enough to push his body forward. Deprived of calories, it entered its final stage, beginning to devour itself. First, the fat disappeared, and then the jungle seemed to take hold of the muscles themselves. Antonio was melting away. 28 days of grueling hiking had cost him 55 pounds, turning a strong 35-year-old man into a skeleton covered with skin. His muscles had atrophied to such an extent that walking had become a series of controlled falls, and constant dizziness had long since become the norm. And then the food disappeared completely. For 3 days in a row, the search yielded nothing. Not a single fruit, not a single nest. The monkeys, his unwitting guides, had also disappeared. The only thing keeping him going was his fading willpower and the murky water from the streams. On the 35th day of his survival, the system that had been working at its limit for so long finally failed. While crossing a relatively flat area, his legs simply gave way, as if they had suddenly been turned off. His body collapsed onto the damp ground. His mind, still clear, desperately tried to command his legs to get up, but they no longer obeyed. He was out of fuel. It seemed like the end. And yet, the routine that had become ingrained in his brain over the last month proved more decisive than fatalism. It was impossible to walk, but there was one last option left: to crawl. Summoning the last drops of willpower, he forced his body to perform the familiar ritual. It crawled to the palm trees. Already lying on his side, with trembling, unresponsive hands, he somehow managed to build his last primitive shelter. It was no longer a shelter for the night. It was a quiet admission of defeat, a place chosen to die. He crawled under it. Everything that could be done had been done. The 28-day journey through hell was over. Hell had won. There was no panic. Instead, a deep, almost icy calm came over him. His thoughts turned to his family, to his mother. He whispered a prayer and closed his eyes, truly letting go of the situation for the first time in 35 days. He lay in deafening silence, in that twilight state when the body has completely surrendered and the mind is just beginning to fade. And through this hum of all-consuming fatigue, something completely alien pierced through like a needle. It was a sound that did not belong in this forest, not the roar of a jaguar, not the cry of monkeys, but a sharp, mechanical, intermittent screech. The sound of a chainsaw. For a split second his consciousness flashed, but then immediately faded again. His brain, exhausted by 35 days of starvation, had already played cruel tricks on him many times, painting feasts and banquets on the patterns of tree bark. There was no guarantee that this sound was not another, final hallucination, a farewell salute from his dying consciousness. The sound stopped, leaving him in even more profound silence, but resumed a minute later. It was too steady, too methodical to be a deception. It was real. There were people there. Antonio looked up at the sky where twilight was already gathering through the sparse gaps in the treetops. To go now, in his condition, into the darkness meant certain death. To lost his way, fall into a ravine, and break his leg one step away from salvation. He had to make the most agonizing decision of his entire ordeal. He would wait. He would spend another night in agony, listening to the darkness, praying that the sound was not a phantom. If it were a hallucination, he would die here before dawn. If the sound was real, it was his last chance. The night was endless, stretched out in the torture of hope. On the morning of the 36th day, he lay motionless, afraid to breathe, listening. Silence. An hour passed, 2, and then again. The same screech, confident and close. It came from the east, from the very direction he was desperately crawling toward. Antonio Sena gathered what could no longer be called strength. It was pure, concentrated will. He struggled to get on all fours and crawled toward the sound, which had become his only reality. Crawling through another curtain of vines toward the sound, Antonio froze. In front of him, in a small clearing, was a blue tarp under which lay baskets of Brazilian chestnuts and tools. Not far away, with his back to him, a man was working, and the roar of the chainsaw completely drowned out his approach. Antonio tried to shout, but only a hoarse, barely audible groan escaped from his parched, inflamed throat. The man, perhaps sensing something, turned off the saw. He turned around and froze. A stranger was staring at him from the undergrowth. His condition was shocking. Sunken eyes, clothes reduced to rags, and a body emaciated from 36 days of starvation. Antonio staggered forward. He could barely speak, but he gathered his remaining strength to explain. He said he was a pilot, Antonio Sena, that his plane had crashed 36 days ago. For a moment, there was silence. Then the chestnut gatherer, realizing what he had seen, dropped his tool and shouted, calling the others. A second later, other people ran out of the forest. They surrounded him and sat him down on the ground. Someone handed him a flask of water. It was the first clean water he had had in weeks, not from a muddy stream, and the first sensation not associated with pain. It was a family of chestnut gatherers led by 67-year-old Maria Jorge dos Santos Tavares. They looked at him and cried. And here, in this remote corner of the globe, two parallel stories of despair converged. Antonio found himself in this wilderness because the pandemic had destroyed his restaurant and forced him to take a deadly job. Maria Jorge, as it turned out later, had not been in this part of the jungle for 3 years. She and her family had returned here, to this dangerous remote area, only because her husband had died during the same pandemic, leaving the family in heavy debt. two victims of a global catastrophe, driven to the same spot in the wild forest to save each other. Maria treated him like a son. He was immediately given clean clothes and food, a little boiled cassava and chestnuts. Still, they fed him little by little, with motherly care, knowing that a large amount of food would kill his emaciated body. Maria had an amateur radio transmitter in the camp. She contacted her daughter Miriam in the nearest village, Laranchal do Jari. Miriam immediately called Roline, Antonio's mother. The first response was predictable. Roline didn't believe it. She decided it was a cruel, unthinkable joke. Her son was dead. The Brazilian Air Force had officially called off the search a week ago. The searchers, hearing this on the radio, understood what was going on. They asked Antonio something that only his family could know. Through Miriam, they relayed a single word to his mother over the radio, his dog's nickname, Gancho. There was silence on the other end of the line, which seemed to last forever. And then, sobs mixed with disbelief, shock, and boundless relief. The rescue machine, which had been stopped weeks ago, started up again. But this time it wasn't the Brazilian Air Force. The state police received the signal. A few hours later, which seemed like another dream to Antonio, a police helicopter appeared over the pickers' camp. The propeller blades cut through the air above his head. Antonio, too weak to walk on his own, was carefully loaded on board. Takeoff. Through the window, the green carpet of the jungle, which had been his prison for 36 days, finally began to shrink and recede into the distance. The news of his rescue spread faster than the helicopter. By the time he landed at Santarém Airport at 3:45 p.m., chaos already reigned on the tarmac. TV cameras, reporters, friends, and his family were waiting for him. As soon as the helicopter touched the ground, his brother Tiago and sister Mariana rushed to him. Brazilian television cameras captured the moment. The door opens, and his siblings see the man they thought was dead. It was a frantic, desperate reunion, full of tears and cries of relief, right on the runway. He was transferred from the helicopter to a waiting ambulance. Even there, already lying on a stretcher, he managed to wave to dozens of people gathered at the airport fence. He was immediately taken to a private hospital. The doctors, already prepared to receive him, were shocked by his condition but amazed that he was conscious. The medical chart started that evening, recording the dry but shocking facts. Antonio's 36-day survival had cost him 55 pounds. His body was in a state of extreme dehydration and profound exhaustion. He was immediately hooked up to IVs to replenish his loss of fluids and vital nutrients. Antonio Sena, 36 days later, was safe. On 20th of March, after several weeks of intensive recovery in the hospital, the long-awaited reunion with his mother, Roline, took place. Antonio Sena, whose hands were still visibly shaking, looked at the world with new eyes, trying to comprehend the full depth of what had happened. The man who boarded that Cessna on 28th of January no longer existed. That flight was a compromise with his conscience, a flight that carried diesel fuel to destroy the forest. But his return on 6th March became a story of being saved by the forest itself. The very jungle he had indirectly helped poison ended up sharing everything he needed to live with him. He was given clean water from streams when his own supplies ran out. Food was literally shown to him through the habits of monkeys, teaching him to eat the brew fruit. Precious protein was found in the form of blue nambu eggs and shelter in broad palm leaves. This 36-day survival experience became a complete rebirth. He came to a deep understanding that the Amazon is not just a resource. As he himself would later say, it is not one forest, but 4 or 5 different forests woven together. And with this understanding came a new mission: to devote his second gifted life to its protection.